There we go. Takes a second. Awesome. Well, thank you all again for joining us for our Navigating the Legislature training series. We're super excited to be here with you all this Saturday morning. My name is Alice, and I am the Deputy Director at Catalyst Montana. I am located in Missoula. I use she, her pronouns, and I have worked the last two sessions in various ways. In 2021, I was a staff member for the Minority Caucus in the House, as well as a staff member to the Indian Caucus. And then last session in 2023, I worked with a coalition of organizations on things like voting rights and issues that were coming up around our state Supreme Court. So I've got a pretty good base of knowledge for the legislative session, both kind of inside and also outside. But there's always more to learn. As many of you all know, the legislative session is a huge thing that happens. And so if you do ask any questions today, either in the chat or during our Q&A portion at the end, we will do our best to answer. And if we don't have an answer for you right away, I'm always happy to find what that answer is and get back to you. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Julia, and then they will pass it to Han to introduce themselves.
Cool. Thanks, Alice. Good morning, everybody. My name is Julia Maxon. I use they, them pronouns. I am the program director with Catalyst Montana. Similarly to Alice, I feel like I've worked in varying capacities the last couple of sessions starting in 2019 as an organizer for Planned Parenthood here in Montana. I continued that work in the 2021 session, and then most recently, in the 2023 session, I did some organizing around LGBTQ rights and other issues, and was doing that in a capacity for Montana Women Vote, which is now Catalyst Montana, which we'll talk about. But yeah, so lovely to see you all here today on a sweet Saturday morning, and I'll pass it over to Han.
Hi, everyone. My name is Han, and I use they, them pronouns. I'm community organizer with Montana Women Vote. I'm here to provide tech support today and try to answer questions in the chat.
Thanks, Han. Julia kind of previewed it, but we're also really excited because this series of trainings is our first series of trainings or really events under our new name, Catalyst Montana. Montana Human Rights Network and Montana Women Vote have merged in the last couple of weeks. We announced our merging, I think, on Monday, December 3rd, maybe it was. If that was the Monday, it was whatever Monday that was. And they're really, really excited because what it has allowed us to do is to pool resources and networks and supporters to really be able to focus on the work that we do, have done as organizations, but continue to do moving forward. We came up with the name Catalyst Montana, which we're really excited about because we really view ourselves in this organization as a organization that aims to catalyze Montanans throughout the state into action in whatever way that looks. We're also really excited because one of the things we wanted to make sure a name brought with it was our ability to be responsive to issues that the folks we work with care about. And so not to be kind of maybe pigeonholed into a specific tactic necessarily like voting registration, which we will continue to do, but we also have a lot of other tactics like engaging with the legislative session, right? And so we're really, really excited about this merger and would be happy to talk with folks offline more about this. So far, we've heard really great feedback, and a lot of folks are really excited, which is really awesome. So we are Catalyst Montana now, though, and are excited to be holding this training with you all. To give you a little bit of the lay of the land for this training today, we've kind of broke it into three portions. The first one is really all about understanding the process and sort of what is behind the curtain, so to speak. It's about the structures of the legislature. The second part is about impacting the process and the legislature, how to like support bills, how to connect with your legislator, all of that sort of thing. And then the last third part, again, will be Q&A, which we'll wrap up with the end. Just as a reminder, you can put your questions into the chat and we'll get some answers to you during. But happy to have some maybe more expansive questions near the end as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julia to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. So to get us going and to get more deeply into what all makes up the legislative process, um, in a second here, I'm going to walk us through some of the basics. Um, and for some of this might be new info. For others, it might be not new info, and that's okay. We're here to learn and support each other. Um, and trying to figure it all out. I think something to note is that I feel like in a lot of ways the legislative process can be a little wonky. The legislature has its own language, it can be fast moving, and we want to acknowledge that that in and of itself can be frustrating, but also like intentional in the way in which that system is built. And what we're trying to do with this workshop is really break down those barriers and making that space just a little bit more accessible. Um, so we hope that after this workshop, if you find it useful, and if you're in different community spaces or share community spaces with others, that you think who might also find it useful, we encourage you to reach out to us, because we're happy to do this training and want to share this knowledge far and wide. So with that, to dig right into the structure, I think Alice, can you hit the next slide? Oh, thank you. Um, so to go through the basics, I'm just going to kind of walk us through each bullet that's lined out here. Um, so in terms of the makeup of the legislature, Montana has 100 House districts and 50 Senate districts. Each representative represents one House district with about 1,000 people, or not 1,000 people, my bad, 10,000 people, give or take. And then each Senate district is usually made up of two House districts, so that usually equates to around 20,000 people, give or take. Um, Something to note about the legislature in Montana is that it convenes, in January and usually runs through the end of April, early May. And what's unusual about Montana's legislature too is that we meet every other year. So we meet every 2 years. Um, some states, I feel like a lot of states typically meet every year, and there's a handful of states that meet every other year, and Montana is included in that. And that's just something that's unique and of note. And we usually, like I said, we meet from January, so coming up here soon, and then through the end of April, and we work up to 90 days. And at the end of those 90 days, or up to those 90 days, we close out with something called Sine Die, which I feel like a couple of us on staff have talked about, like, especially in entering this space, you hear that word thrown around a lot of just like, what does Sine Die mean? Sine Die mean? Um, and I think it's just really like a fancy way to mean the end. But that's just like some legislative jargon that just um, is also of note. Some other things to touch on is that, with our House representatives, they serve 2-year terms, and usually they're up for re-election every time a statewide election comes up, and then senators serve 4-year terms. We do have term limits here in Montana, so usually folks can serve up to 8 years in each chamber, but no more than 8 years in each of those respective chambers. To go to the next slide, something to note too with our legislative process is that um, legislative districts are created through this process called legislative redistricting, which happens every 10 years. So this map is just how our legislative districts look at the present moment, and was created through that process, which was also informed by the census that happens every 10 years. You can see on the map it's a little small, so don't try and zoom in or strain your eyes too much. But you can see that, in some of the rural parts of the state, we have some pretty large or bigger drawn out districts. And then there's other parts of the state, maybe more so on the western half, where those districts are a little bit smaller and more so a little bit more densely populated. Um, in many other states, the legislators themselves draw the districts. But in Montana, like I had mentioned before, we have an independent redistrict unless Alice, you had any additional thoughts to add to the redistricting slide.
No, no. I was pretty involved with the redistricting process this last go around, and so it's one of my favorite things to talk about. But if folks would love to talk about it at some point, please follow up, and I'm happy to find some time. But yeah, great job.
Cool. So before I pass it back over to Alice, did want to talk through something that we call committees. So once the legislature, is elected, um, post November and post election, legislators are assigned to committees, and every legislator is assigned to typically serve on between 2 to 4 committees each. Um, Committees are an important part of the legislative structure for a variety of reasons. I would like to heavily emphasize that one of the big reasons that committees are important is because it's where a bulk of the work happens. And, that can be in relation to like amendments, et cetera, and also where bills are typically first heard. So we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of influencing the legislative process. But committees are a place where like testifying happens. So it's a great spot to kind of make your voice heard and to help, inform and shape policy and directly talk to your legislators or a specific committee. Um, a couple other things to note with committees is that House and Senate committees have different names for their committees, but you know, uh, they basically handle the same bills and have a same sort of process. But yeah, again, they just maybe have a little bit of like a naming or a difference in naming structure. I don't know why that entirely is, and that to me feels a little overly complicated, but just something to note. So take, for example, looking at the 2 chambers on the screen, so the House and the Senate. Um, for example, under, let's see, yeah, House, we have, let's see, or I guess under Senate, um, we have, I'm trying to see because my screen is a little tiny. Um, Appropriations. So under House, we have appropriations, but then in Senate, it's called Finance and Claims. They both work on issues related to like spending and like the budget. They do similar things. They're just called something different. And they work on similar bills and again are also made up of different legislators, but just something to note. Also, like with like the top example, agriculture and then agriculture, livestock, and irrigation, again, work on similar bills, just a different name. Um, that's a little bit about committees. I'll pass it back to Alice, to talk through leadership.
Awesome, thank you. And I just want to note that we have Linda in the chat who gave us a definition for sine die, which is awesome. Thank you so much. We love learning from folks who are joining us as well. It's a great point that and I'll talk about it in the next slide, actually, the legislative calendar. Sine die comes at the end of the legislative session, but doesn't necessarily mean the work is fully done. So we'll talk about that in a second, but thank you. And if folks want to check that out, please do. So legislative leadership, there's a number of roles that make up leadership in both the House and the Senate chambers. One of the roles, which is incredibly important, is the Speaker of the House, and then on the Senate side, it's the President of the Senate. The Speaker and the President are important to know because they have a lot of power in how the session ends up playing out. They have a lot of power in how committees end up being built, the makeup of those committees we talked about. And then they also have the power, the authority to decide where bills go for committees. So sometimes you might hear about something called a kill committee. That's a term that a lot of folks use during the session, or you might hear in different ways. And that can be a really positive thing, or it can be a really horrible thing. In sessions where it's less good, we see kill committees being made up so that good legislation that you might want to see pass through our legislature go to that committee and don't end up getting to move on throughout the process. And the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate might use that strategically to make sure stuff isn't moving through the process in a positive way. We can also see it work in a way that is more favorable for like the issues that I care about, for example, where House or Senate leadership might create a committee where they send things that they don't want to have to debate on the floor because they are just not good policy. They are like mean, honestly. So, for example, you might see House or Senate leadership send legislation that is attacking our trans friends and community members. We might see them send those types of legislation to a kill committee because they don't want it to move further in the process. They don't want to have to debate it on the House or Senate floor. And that might be a position that would be really positive for us and like hopefully being able to not have to spend all of this time and energy and also just like harming community members having to debate that issue, right? So there's a couple different ways that committee makeup and committee assignments can be really impactful in a lot of different forms. Another note about legislative leadership is that they are elected by their peers. So the House Majority Caucus elects their leaders, and the House Minority Caucus elects their leaders on both the House and Senate side, which is important to know. So it's not the full House or Senate that is electing the minority leader, for example. It's only the Minority Caucus that's electing their minority leader. Another part of that makes up the structure of the session is the legislative calendar. We'll show you where you can also access this on the website pretty easily, but this is an awesome tool to refer back to because the legislature really kind of lives by its deadlines in a lot of ways. So this is a screenshot of the first month of the session in January. You can find this right now, and you'll see that the calendar, it lays out legislative days and the number of legislative days that it is. And Julia talked a little bit about our legislative working days, but I want to revisit and just note that a legislative working day is when either the House or the Senate gavel in a floor session. So, for example, Medicaid expansion, you might see the Health and Human Services Committee have a hearing, have a big meeting on a Saturday, but that does not count as a legislative workday unless there is a House or Senate floor session as well. That's important to note because there could be stuff happening, right? And if you're not looking, so like here, for example, if you're not paying attention, there might be something, a big hearing, a big important hearing to be happening on the 18th of January. And if you're only looking at the legislative calendar, you might not know that because it doesn't say that it's a legislative day. Another part about this, and you can see at the top, is that they have these lovely color codes which show what some of our deadlines are during the session. And there's a lot of deadlines, but I want to talk specifically about transmittal deadline, which is again another word that a lot of folks hear and may not know what that is. Transmittal deadline is the sort of halfway point between the beginning and the end of the session. And it's the point in which a bill that starts in either chamber, so say a bill starts in the House, by transmittal deadline, the bill has to make it from the House through the process and it has to transmit to the Senate in order to continue on through the legislative process. With the caveat of if that bill is like has a fiscal attached to it, so it has some sort of way that it is dealing with money as well. That deadline comes a few weeks later. Also, if a bill is suggesting a constitutional amendment or that sort of thing, it also has a deadline that is a little bit later that it needs to make that transition to the other side. But transmittal deadline is really important because you see a lot of bills stopped within the process at that point. And it's both a positive and a negative. The closer you get to transmittal deadline, the quicker things start to move because people are trying to get their bills through the session before transmittal deadline happens. But on the other hand, at the end of that deadline, we do see a number of bills that are not going to continue on. And that can be helpful just in terms of like lightening the load a little bit and knowing what you need to focus on for the last half of the session. Typically, the legislature meets Monday through Friday, but again, they will start having Saturday sessions as well. It's pretty early that we are seeing a Saturday session already in late January, but you know, they are really trying to get some legislative days moving. Um, and then we will also typically see a session that is you have committees in the morning, and then or floor or House or Senate floor session at in the midday, starting at 1, and then committee meetings again in the afternoon after floor session. So now we're going to hop into how a bill becomes a law in the Montana legislature. Lots of folks may have seen the Schoolhouse Rock video that's about how a bill becomes a law on the federal level. That is a really great video, but we're going to talk specifically about how a bill becomes a law here in Montana. So we have this lovely graphic, which is from the Montana Budget and Policy Center, and highly recommend checking them out. They've got lots of graphics that are really great to share with folks. But I'm actually going to even start before this graphic starts and say that the bill making process can start as early as the summer before the legislative session starts. So holdover legislators who are senators who are not up for re-election can start to request bill drafts pretty early on. Additionally, if someone gets through their primary and they're running unopposed for the general election, they can also start to request bill drafts. So you will see bill drafts start to come through. Usually they'll start to put them up on the website in September-ish, maybe October. But if you wanted to, you could call Legislative Services and ask for them to send a list of bills that have already been requested, even as early as like August. I've done that in the past, and it can be really helpful to sort of get a start on things. Legislators will request a lot of bills, but often they are not actually the ones, or they will not actually sponsor every single one of those bills. And bills that are requested, that doesn't necessarily mean that those are going to become full-blown bills and pieces of legislation moving through the process. Right now, I think we have probably close to 2,000, somewhere around there, give or take, bills that have been requested. Not all of those are going to end up becoming legislation. When a bill is requested, it gets what is referred to as an LC number. And then that LC number will follow the bill throughout its whole process. But once it's introduced, which we'll talk about, is when it actually gets a official bill number, which is like HB House Bill 232 or that sort of thing. Another thing that's great to pay attention to with requesters is that often when a bill is introduced, well, not often, you might see that there is a different person who requested the bill versus the person who sponsored it. Most of the time, that is going to be the same person, but there is a difference occasionally. And that can be a great spot to look at to see if there's maybe a strategy around a bill. So say that someone who maybe is a less popular legislator wants to see a piece of legislation moved. They might request a bill and work to get it drafted and ready to go, and then find a sponsor who will actually introduce and sponsor that bill through the process. And so it can be really interesting, right, to see who is the requester versus who is the sponsor of legislation. At that point, once a bill has been requested, legislator will work with the legislative staff and staff attorneys that will help to actually draft the language of that so that it becomes what you see of legal language in the way that we write our laws. And then if it gets to a point where a legislator wants to continue through the process with this bill, they will introduce it. And they do that by, once the session starts, they'll take a physical copy of the bill and they will go to what is referred to as, lovingly referred to as, the hopper in the Capitol building. To me, it looks a little bit like a big voting like ballot drop box, but they'll go and they'll drop the piece of legislation into the hopper, and at that point it's going to be introduced and read on the House or Senate floor. This is also really kind of a fun tradition because you will also see who, like, first-time legislators, they'll often take a picture of themselves with their first piece of legislation that they're about to drop into the hopper. And it's just kind of a fun piece of tradition that happens. Once the bill is actually introduced, it goes to the House or Senate floor, depending on where it's originating, right? And it has first reading. This is when the bill gets referred to a committee. And so it's a really important thing to pay attention to. And that bill goes to committee. And then the committee can it doesn't have really a timeline outside of those deadlines that we were talking about earlier that we see. So transmittal, for example. So a committee can hold on to a piece of legislation for sort of as long as they'd like. But in Montana, we also have, I actually don't know if this is unique to us or if other states do this, but something I'm really grateful for is that we have kind of a rule that says that every piece of legislation that's introduced and referred to committee gets to have a hearing. Most of the time, that means we have rules in place that say they have to schedule a hearing at least 3 days out so that the public has opportunity to learn about that hearing and get engaged in some way. However, the closer you get to certain deadlines, like transmittal or the end of the session, sometimes that starts to get a little wishy-washy, and you might see a bill scheduled for a hearing that same day, even later that afternoon.
Hey,
Yeah.
we have someone kind of struggling to see in the chat. Is there any way you could zoom in a little bit more
Mm,
by going like to, you know how you can go to the three dots and then zoom in up top?
yes. Sorry, folks, 1 second. I actually am not seeing that fully. I will say that some of these things are, yes, a little hard to read, and we will be sending out the slides afterwards as well. I'm not seeing something where it says zoom in.
I don't know if you
Okay.
can go to the three dots on the right hand upper corner.
Mm-hmm.
If you can like zoom in there or if it'll mess everything up. But
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not seeing an option to zoom in from those three dots. So
oh,
sorry.
I
I'm
meant
so sorry, folks.
okay. That's
Um, yeah, again, I apologize for that. I am going to walk through the whole process here, and then of course we will also send out these slides. So hope that will be helpful as well. So I apologize, folks. Um, okay, in a committee hearing. So we have bill gets referred to a committee can hold on to it for a while, but it will ultimately have a hearing on that committee or on that bill within the committee. And that is a really great opportunity for the public to get involved, which we will talk about later in our presentation of how you might do that. But this is where you see people coming to provide testimony during a committee hearing. At that point, again, typically the committee, after a hearing happens, will take action on that bill on a later date. Sometimes you see that get, again, moved around. It might be later that day. It might be right after that hearing, depending on how close you are to a deadline. But taking action is when the legislators of that committee have the opportunity to debate that bill and potentially bring forward amendments. They will also then vote on that bill during executive action, is what it is called, and decide whether or not they want the bill to go back to the House or Senate floor, or if they want to stop the bill in its tracks so that it's not continuing forward. If they vote no and they don't want to continue the bill forward in the process, that is referred to as a bill being tabled in committee. And then at that point, it's not fully dead. It can be brought back from the table by another vote of the committee, but you don't see that super often. Important to pay attention to in case it happens, but it's not a really common occurrence. If the committee votes yes and votes to move it in further into the process, the bill goes back to the House or Senate floor for second reading. Another way that a bill can make it to the House or Senate floor without a committee voting yes on it is through a blast motion. So the House or Senate floor can vote to blast a bill out of committee. And that is done through, you have to have a certain number of votes for a certain threshold, which is determined session to session. This year in the House, it is 56 yes votes to successfully do a blast motion. And in the Senate, it is 26. So in the House, it's a little more than a simple majority. In the Senate, it is a simple majority. Again, that is not a super consistent occurrence, but it does happen. And it'll be interesting to see, because those thresholds are pretty low, how that might be used strategically throughout this upcoming session. During second reading, that is when all of the legislators in the House or in the Senate have the opportunity to debate a bill on the floor during floor session. That is when you'll see folks stand up and make comments on the bill for or against. This is only a time for legislators to weigh in on a bill. The public does not get to provide comment at this time. But the other thing that can happen here too, and again is not super common, but legislators can also bring amendments on the House or Senate floor. Not super common. It's harder to get those passed than it is in a committee, but it is something that can happen, and also can be a really great opportunity to do some sort of messaging. If you say it's Medicaid expansion and someone wants to highlight that there's a lot of really great things that could be being done that maybe aren't added, they might bring an amendment just to be able to kind of like talk about that stuff at that point in time, even if they know it's not going to pass. After second reading, after there's the debate, they will vote on that for second reading. And that vote is a pretty good determination typically of what is going to happen with that bill in that chamber. If the chamber votes no, then the bill dies and it doesn't get to go on to third reading. But if the chamber votes yes, it goes on to third reading, and that is the final vote that a bill has in that chamber. Sometimes you will see, if on the second reading the votes are pretty close, there is a lot of work going on then behind the scenes between second and third reading to try and flip votes. So folks who might be movable are probably getting a lot of calls. They're getting a lot of emails, a lot of talks from lobbyists, a lot of discussion from organizations like ours, trying to get them to change their vote for third reading, either potentially to like kill or stop the bill in that process, or on the flip side, to make sure that they stay strong and that they vote the way that we need them to vote in order to continue a bill through the process. After third reading in either the House or the Senate, the bill is then transmitted to the other chamber, and it goes through the whole process on the other side again. Once it's gone through that process, if there are no amendments made in the second chamber, then it will be sent to the governor to either sign or veto it or whatnot. If it does have changes in the other side, it has amendments added to it in the second chamber, then the bill will go back to the original chamber. They will either accept those amendments or they'll say, no, we don't like what was done here. If that's the case, there is a conference committee that is created. So members from the House and the Senate will come together to create a conference committee for that specific bill. They are tasked with having conversation and working out something that would work for both chambers. And then that bill goes back to be approved by both chambers and then continues on by getting sent to the governor if it is approved by both chambers at that point. The governor then has, again, the opportunity to veto things. The governor also has the opportunity to sign things. And there's also a 10-day period where if the governor does not either veto or sign it, the law still goes into effect and goes to the Secretary of State's office to be filed away in Montana Code Annotated, or MCA, which is our big book of laws. Reasons why the governor might want to sit down and actually sign a bill is if they want to do like a big kind of press thing around it. They want to get the picture, or it's maybe a legislator's first bill being signed into law, and so they want to have kind of like the photo op part of it. Maybe it was a priority bill for the governor, and so they really want to like show that it got passed and kind of make a big hubbub about it. A lot of legislation does not get that like official sign for just a multitude of reasons. Say there's a bill saying in transportation that is about changing the color of snow removal vehicles, like from one color to another color. Maybe that's not something that they want to have like a big hubbub about. It's, it's not affecting anything big. And so they wait that 10-day period, and it goes into law anyway. There's lots of stuff like that. But you might also see situations where maybe there is a bill that's really controversial, and that a governor maybe doesn't want their name attached to, but they also don't want to veto it and they want it to go into law. And so they might not officially sign it for that reason as well. That is less common, but it does happen and is something to know about the way that a bill can become a law. Separate from this is separate but not is the budget. I will say that we are not, I would say, experts on the budget, and encourage folks to reach out to the Montana Budget and Policy Center, who are really great partners in this work, and they are experts on the budget, but we have some good information to kind of help you get started and get your bearings about the budget here. The budget process starts pretty early on, and it starts with agencies requesting their 2-year budget, their biennium budget, to the governor. Montana, of course, we have a 2-year budget, a biennium budget, because our legislature only meets once every 2 years. And so they have to approve a budget then that will take us to the next legislative session. The governor then takes those requests and also the governor's own priorities, and will release what is referred to as the governor's budget, typically in November. This year it was released on November 15th and is available for folks to take a look at. And that actually becomes HB2, so House Bill 2. House Bill 2 is the same thing every single legislative session. House Bill 2 is always the budget, which is really helpful to know. So House Bill 2 is introduced. It is introduced in the House, as you might expect, and it starts its process there. It goes to House Appropriations, which is a House committee that deals with the budget. And then it gets split up into these sections of the budget into joint subcommittees. Joint subcommittees are similar to conference committees in that they are made up of members from the House and the Senate who come together to form this joint subcommittee and take pieces of the budget. Then those subcommittees go line item by line item and check every single thing that is included in the HB2 and make changes. They might remove things, they might add different numbers, all sorts of stuff. They might make amendments in various ways. And that process happens, it gets started really, really early. So, day one, they will start doing this. They'll get stuff moving. And I would say in the first month of the session, it is a lot of work of being done on the budget through these joint subcommittees. They also have hearings, just like regular committees. It can be a bit tougher to track what is being heard in a committee and what you might be able to provide comment on, just because the structure of these joint subcommittees is just they're going through so many things all the time, and they're going line item by line item. It's not quite as cut and dry as if they are hearing like a separate bill. But again, Montana Budget and Policy Center is a really great organization to connect with because they have staffers who will be tracking every section of the budget and can kind of give a good idea of when something might be coming up. So say you really, really care about county roads, and you want to be able to provide input on why you think it's important that the Montana state government funds county roads for whatever reason. You could chat with someone who is helping to track all that sort of stuff in section C and subcommittee C, and potentially have someone who can help you figure out when that specific line item will be heard, and you could come in and provide testimony. Once the joint subcommittees do their work, it goes back to House Appropriations to be voted on in whole. Once House Appropriation says yes and passes it back to the House, It then goes through the same voting process that another bill would go on the House floor. Usually they'll take a full day to just deal with the budget because it's such a huge thing. There will be debate. Folks might bring amendments at that time as well. And then ultimately, once the House passes this, it goes to the Senate for Finance and Claims in that committee. They do this, they will vote as Senate Finance and Claims on the budget. It won't go into subcommittees again, right? Because those subcommittees were joint subcommittees. So the Finance and Claims will vote on it. It'll go back to the Senate to be voted on the Senate floor. And then at that point, it will, if it's passed by both chambers again, with the same process as before, it'll go to the governor to be signed. The budget is not the only way that money is spent in the session. As we mentioned earlier, sometimes legislators will bring a bill that they care about that requires some level of funding, and it will have a fiscal note attached to it. Or they might suggest something that would be like a new tax. Sometimes you see people suggesting sales tax here in Montana, for example, and that would be its own bill, just like any other kind of bill. It's just dealing with money. So at the end of the session, before the budget is like signed by the governor, there's a process that they go through to combine both the budget with anything that the legislature has passed that spends or brings in money, and then it'll kind of become this like big what the actual budget is for the next 2 years. So it's a really big process, lots of ins and outs, and can get pretty complicated, but it is also really important because, of course, this is how our government spends our money, which is important to be aware of. Now that we know kind of the process that the legislation goes through to become a bill, we're going to jet through some of these tools for navigating the session before I pass it back to Julia to talk about how you can influence legislation. And we're going to start by showing just some screenshots of what the new updated legislative website looks like. You'll notice that there's some differences as we go from last session to this session. Here on the homepage is the legislative calendar you can see in the bottom left, which I think is really helpful. I think it's much more just like easily accessible. And another thing that is different this year is that instead of laws, which used to be our program for being able to see what legislation was coming through, the legislature has moved to this software called Bill Explorer. The reason for that is because laws was such an old program that it actually wasn't being consistently updated on the back end anymore. And so it wasn't a very like secure platform to be able to have. And so they've moved to Bill Explorer now, which is also, I think, pretty intuitive once you kind of get the hang of it. So in the top right, you'll see a search bar. You can type in an issue that you care about, or maybe a legislator that you want to see what they're up to, and it'll populate some of those bills that you might be interested in. There's also a button that says filters right next to the search bar. And if you click that, it'll pop up on the left-hand side a number of filters that you can then play around with, including the session year, for example, or maybe, again, if you want to look up what a specific legislator is doing. You can also look up by committees, for example. So maybe you want to see what House Judiciary has up for any given week. You can search, you can use those filters there too. Back to the home page, you will see in the top right corner where there's a red circle around, there is a button that I think also makes this very easy to access the streaming website, the live streams for the session. I think that this feels a lot easier for me to access than it did previously, so I'm really excited about this. When you click that button, it'll take you to the live stream platform for committee hearings, but also for House and Senate floor sessions. Something that's really cool that we have available to us is the fact that every committee meeting, whether it's a hearing or the committee is taking every executive action, and every House and Senate floor session are streamed online, and then they are also recorded. which is really, really cool. So maybe you have a super busy day and you can't sit there and listen to a committee hearing for 6 hours. But what you can do is, and they're pretty good about updating this consistently within about a 24-hour period. The next day, you could go back and look at that recording and find the part that you care about. Um, this is something that anyone can access, but this is not how you would provide remote testimony, for example. We'll talk about that later as well. But this is a really great way to just know what's kind of happening during the session and hear what is happening in committees um, on specific bills and legislation. On the left-hand side, you can see there's a couple buttons. There's a calendar one, which you can click dates. So say you knew that there was something you wanted to look at on February 12th, and it is March 16th. You can use the calendar to go back to February 12th and find all of the recordings that are from that day, which is cool. And then on the right, there's an agenda button kind of in the middle of those two things on the right. And for recordings, if you click that, there are timestamps for bills that you can click and it'll take you to that specific bill hearing. It'll also have a timestamp for executive action when they are voting on debating bills, bringing forward amendments. At least in previous sessions, it has not been then laid out by bills that they've done in executive action. So you kind of have to search through that period of time. But it is still much more helpful than it would be to just like try and find throughout the recording itself. The other part that I just want to highlight on the website is this Find Your Legislator portion. So on the top, it'll be the second from the left. And it has ways to look up legislators and also to figure out who your legislator is. If you click that Find Your Legislator button, which is the second one down on the left, that'll take you to a map where you can either like put in your address or you can like look around in the map and figure out actually which districts you are in and who your representative or your senator is, which is really great. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Julia to talk about what you might do with that information once you find it.
Cool. Yeah, so we spent some time talking through the structure and tools. So now I want to dig into the bulk of like how do you influence this process? So there are many ways in which we can influence the legislative process. We'll go through a couple, but do again want to just acknowledge that, this is not necessarily built for people without power, wealth, and privilege, but that doesn't mean that we can't necessarily and concretely influence the process. We absolutely can. We can change the outcome of bills, either, supporting or passing good bills or killing bad bills. And we can also absolutely change the way in which legislators vote. And if anything else, we can also just change the public narrative around it all. So with that, one of the first ways that we can influence this process is just by directly contacting and connecting with your legislator. Um, so one thing that I would love for you all to do, if you haven't done this already, at the bottom of this screen, there's a big number that's highlighted. It's 406-444-4800. Would recommend that you take out your phone and just add that as a contact. This is for the legislative switchboard. And for those that aren't super familiar with navigating the switchboard, basically what it allows you to do is you can call this number. They have staff that answer it from 7:30 in the morning till 5 p.m. at night. And they are there to take your message, whether you want to like support or oppose a bill and relay it to like either your legislator, or I think they can also relay it up to like 10 people, or like you can relay it to like a committee. But yeah, this is a really good way directly to like influence the process. Usually, and I say usually, most of the time, folks are super friendly at the switchboard, and they are just wanting to make sure that they can relay and get your message to your legislator. If you don't know your legislator immediately, again, on the previous slide, Alice mentioned that you can go on to the legmt.gov website. But I also feel like in my previous experience in contacting the switchboard. If you give them your address, they can also look up your legislators for you if you don't know them off the top of your head. Um, yeah, and then I think the only other thing to note too about contacting your legislator is that if you've ever watched a floor session, sometimes you'll see like these little like stacks of blue paper on legislators' desks. Those are called blue slips, and those are messages that are coming in through the switchboard. Um, Another way to influence the process is to directly show up and testify at a hearing in person. So we spent little bit of time talking through or talking about committees, and that was referenced earlier of like that being a really good space to exercise like your voice and your opinion on issues that you care about. So this is just outlining how you would go about doing that. One thing that we recommend is that, before you show up to testify in person at the Capitol in Helena, spending some time to prep your testimony and prep what you want to say before the hearing. Usually, or it typically follows the format of addressing the chair and members of the committee. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little sample. So you would start off your testimony typically saying, chair, members of the committee, my name is Julia Maxon. You would want to say like your full name, and then spell your last name. So I would say, spelled Maxon. And then I would say, I'm from Missoula, and I represent Catalyst, Montana. You can also say that you represent yourself. You don't have to necessarily represent an organization or other entity. And then you would clearly state, I'm speaking in support of, House Bill 27, or I'm opposing Senate Bill 79, Um, and then usually from there you would say the bulk of the reason why you support or oppose a bill, and then you would close it out with something along the lines of like, I urge um, the committee, or I urge you all to vote no on XYZ bill. Another thing to note, the second bullet here is just about dressing appropriately. I do want to preface that when we say dress appropriately, that means whatever that means to you. Legislators have a dress code, but there isn't necessarily a dress code for folks testifying. So we just urge folks to, show up in what is comfortable to them. We also recommend arriving early to committee hearings because I feel like those typically are they're pretty prompt. They start on time. Um, and then we already talked about the hearing protocol and what you would say. Another thing to note too is that you just want to make sure to keep your testimony within a certain time constraint. So usually that's under 3 minutes. And then the last piece is just being prepared to answer questions from the committee. Typically, I feel like if you're newer to a committee space, the chair or like members of the committee won't necessarily ask you questions. It's usually if like somebody's like showing up a lot or like as a part of an organization where they want to ask that direct question. They'll ask questions of those folks, but you still want to be prepared in case, someone does ask a question of you. So in a similar fashion, you would just want to address, chair and then representative, whoever asked the question. So Representative Smith. And you would say, thank you for the question, and then proceed to answer it. It's absolutely okay to say that you don't know the answer. Or you can refer it to somebody else in the committee. You can also, I've seen folks say like, I don't have that at the moment, but I don't have that answer at the moment, but I'll get back to you soon. Or I can follow up with you about an answer to your question. If you do say that you're going to follow up, just want to heavily emphasize that you should follow up. That's important. Um, Yeah, I think that's primarily it for testifying in person. So the other piece of this is if you are testifying remotely. This is, a relatively new thing that the legislature has incorporated. It started back, in full during the beginning of the pandemic. And I feel like it's allowed a lot of folks, especially folks in rural areas, to participate and engage in the legislative process, and is still continuing on with the 2025 session. So if you want to testify remotely for a committee hearing for a bill out. Um, Going back to that legislative page or t.gov website, um, you'll go to the specific page that's participate, and you will be able to select from a list of bills that are currently scheduled in, I think, up to the next four days. Um, a thing to note with testifying remotely is that you need to sign up um, before the day before and like before 5 p.m. in order to testify. You'll also, through this website, be able to submit written testimony or write a brief message. It'll usually just also ask for like your name, where you're located, and your position or stance on a bill. And then once you fill out that form on this page and submit it, it will send an email to your inbox of the email that you use to register with a Zoom link to testify at the hearing the next day. Um, you do not have to testify in order to submit written comments. Written comments received by the deadline will be distributed to all committee members. And also, if you wish to submit written testimony after the deadline, so let's say after 5 p.m. the day before, again, you can just call the switchboard at that number, the 406-444-4800 number for assistance. When you actually show up to the hearing over Zoom, again, want to emphasize, arriving early or being on time. It'll look different than, or look a little different than the way it looks when like you would just enter the legislative website and click on like that live stream. You will be able to like, see your little video box at the bottom, and then also you'll have an ability to raise your hand during the session as well. Um, a thing to note is that, some committee chairs are pickier than others, and I feel like something I've seen in recent years is that, they typically don't like for you to have like a picture on your Zoom, and like you also aren't going to be on video, so you can again just like dress comfortably or like the way in which you would like. Um, but you won't be on video, and then also just making sure that you don't have like a picture on your um, Zoom video. And then the same rules of decorum or protocols are to be followed, like as if you were testifying in person, just like again addressing the committee in the way of like chair members of the committee when you go up or when you're called on to testify is another thing to note, and that like you want to stick within that 3-minute window. Um, the last thing before I pass it over to Alice too about other ways to influence legislation. So there's a long list here, and I imagine some of you have engaged in some of these different tactics during previous legislative sessions, but these are just some easy ways to influence the process outside of testifying and contacting your legislators. So um, one of them is, organizing or attending a phone bank. Organizations like ours and organizations that we're in partnership with um, do a variety of phone banks throughout the session on certain key bills or issues that we're working on. So I would just, if there's an organization in Montana, we can also like share this information with you all too. But if there's an organization or an issue that you care about, I would strongly recommend like connecting with organizations to see the ways in which like they're organizing around the session. Um, and a phone bank is a good way to, connect with folks who typically are already identified as supporters of an issue or supporters of the organization that you're working with, and just mobilizing and activating them to call their legislator around a specific bill. And if the point or purpose is to like support or oppose it. Phone banking, I feel like can be scary for a lot of folks. It's not an easy thing, but again, it is like a really good way to activate um, folks that you're in community with and folks across the state. Another way to influence legislation is writing a letter to the editor. Again, I imagine some of you have done this before, but for those that haven't, basically what it is that it's, a little piece of writing. It's usually less than like 200 words that you submit to your local paper. Writing it around like an issue that you care about or a specific piece of legislation and how you would like your legislator to vote on it. I feel like this tactic specifically, and like we as a staff to have chatted about this as well, can be really helpful if you dovetail or like um, merge it with a couple different tactics. So below it, it says use social media. Something that you could do, or like work in partnership with another organization to do, is highlight and take a piece from like that letter to the editor and like share that on social media and share about why you care or why you're connecting or want folks to connect on like a specific issue that you're bringing to light. But yeah, broadly, social media is a great tool to activate and organize your communities. Would highly recommend you do that throughout the session, even if it's just asking folks that you're in community with to call the switchboard on a specific bill. Um, Collecting personal stories and delivering them. This is something that we do here at Catalyst Montana. Medicaid expansion is a big issue for us heading into the 2025 session. And so right now we're doing a lot of um, collecting of stories of folks that have been impacted by Medicaid across the state and compiling it into like a larger storybook that we then like share with legislators. It doesn't necessarily have to look like that. It can also be you yourself or your community just sharing out like personal stories of like why you care about a specific bill or a specific policy, and making sure that you get that to, a legislator or your legislator or a committee. And then I'll wrap it up with holding or attending a lobby day. This is great for visibility and like showing legislators, sheer volume and, how many folks care about like a specific issue. Not to plug Medicaid again, and I imagine Alice will chat about this too, is that we are having, a lobby day for Medicaid expansion. Um, and that'll be, in January, but just highly encourage you all to attend, any lobby days that you can, because it's a great way to connect with other folks and a great way to show solidarity in the issues that you care about. And with that, back to you, Alice.
Cool. Sweet. Well, we've got a few things that we love to highlight as things that folks often don't know. And so one of these is just that stairwells are a great place to catch legislators. Often you will see a whole bunch of folks outside of committee rooms or outside of the floor in either the House or Senate trying to get a hold of senators and House representatives. But there's not as many people in the stairwells. And so when folks are going in between committee rooms and House session and all sorts of stuff, that can be a really great place to catch someone. Howell, our executive director, also likes to say too that when you need to chat with a legislator, a great thing to do is to shake their hand, introduce them, introduce yourself, and then don't let go until you're done saying your piece, because then you kind of have them trapped there with you. You can send notes to legislators on the Senate or House floor via a page for $1. It's customary to tip the pages $1. The pages are they help run things on the floor a little bit and like just help legislators with certain things. They are high school students, and so they're there doing getting involved with the state government. And again, it's customary to tip $1. They're high school students, sort of thing. But if you needed to get a hold of a legislator who is sitting on the House or Senate floor and they're not looking at their phone, but you need them to come out to get some sort of important information for something that's coming up, for example, that's one way you might be able to get in touch with them still. You can find most legislators' cell phone numbers in the guidebook, and especially today's day and age, welcome people to text their legislators if that is the easiest way for you to get in contact with them. I know that generationally those things can feel a little different, but especially if you are someone who feels more comfortable getting a hold of them via text or like email, that sort of thing, that's definitely an option. Um, and less people are texting them than are emailing them. So that's always a good thing to note too. Speaking of guidebook, the information desk on the first floor, which I think Han mentioned in the chat as well, has sort of these like legislator um, yearbook type things where it's got all the legislators and their picture and their contact information, which is really great. And you can pick that up on the first floor at the information desk at the Capitol building. You cannot bring drinks or food or backpacks into the gallery in either the House or the Senate. Funny enough, all other bags at this point are okay. You just can't bring backpacks. So you can bring your purse in. If you do have a backpack with you or food or drinks, they will ask you on your coming in, they will ask you to put that in kind of a waiting area outside of the gallery. And also the folks who are up there kind of watching and stuff are pretty on top of it. And so if they see you bringing some food up there and snagging some bites, they are likely going to be pretty quick to ask you to not do that. And then finally here we've got there's a couple bathrooms that are good to know about as well. The basement bathroom is open to the public, although it might feel kind of, it can be hard to know that. It is open to the public and it has a single stall if you want a little more privacy for anything. And then also the fourth floor bathroom has a nursing slash pumping room, which also has a little more privacy for folks who just may need a little more privacy. Couple other ways to get involved are one, we are continuing to host the Policy Leadership Institute. So this is something that Montana Women Vote has been hosting for a long time, and we're excited to be continuing this through Catalyst Montana. This is going to be the 19th annual one on February 14th and 15th this year. That is Valentine's Day weekend, and so we're encouraging folks to bring a sweetheart and come learn about what's happening at the session with us. Registration is open already at this point in time, and so either Han or Julia is going to put that link in the chat for you. And if you're interested in attending, please, please, please do register. There are a couple different ways that you can register that I want to highlight as well. You can either select just the ticket. So if you're like in Helena or around Helena, you just want to make kind of a day trip sort of thing, you can just get a ticket to attend. Or you can opt to get both a ticket and also help figuring out lodging while you're there. We get a room block at the hotel that we hosted at. And then within those two things, we have first tier, which is like a scholarship-based tier. So folks who may not be able to attend due to money, they can click that one and they don't have to pay anything for either one. We have a middle tier, which is we refer to as our sustaining tier. That is kind of like paying for your own attendance or lodging. And then we have a third tier, which is sustaining plus. It's like helping to support other people who might not be able to afford to go otherwise. And this is a really great option for those of us who might be able to take a second to kind of assess where we fall financially and potentially help someone else attend through taking that third tier option. The other way that we're especially encouraging folks to get involved this session is through supporting Medicaid expansion. We're doing a whole lot of work around Medicaid expansion, and there's a few ways you can interact. So you can share your story via the Healthy Montana website. We have a form on there. We're part of this coalition that is really working hard to make sure that Medicaid expansion continues in Montana. So if you have or someone you know has experience having been on Medicaid through like Medicaid expansion specifically, so maybe they work a low income job and wouldn't have been able to afford healthcare otherwise, for example, that is somewhere that you can go fill out that form. And then one of us at Catalyst Montana will get in touch with you to talk more about your story and learn more about who you are as a person. And then also help kind of figure out if there's maybe a way that you might want to share your story that could be impactful to make sure Medicaid expansion continues. We are also working on creating a storybook where we've got a number of folks who have taken a picture of themselves kind of saying like, I care about Medicaid expansion because, and then like input their reason why they care about Medicaid expansion. So this is a great option to do as well if you are not someone who maybe has been on Medicaid expansion in the past, but you care about it and you feel strongly that people deserve health care and such. Would love to connect with you on this to see how you might be able to get into our storybook that way. And then finally, we're also having a rally at the Capitol in Helena on Wednesday, January 15th at 12 p.m., so noon. This will be a rally in support of lifting the sunset on Medicaid expansion and making sure that we are continuing this program. It is the midway point through January in Montana, and it will be outside, so it'll be chilly. But we are working on making sure that we have some hot drinks like coffee, hot chocolate, tea, as well as some propane heaters like you see in restaurants um, out there so that we have some way to also keep folks warm. It's really, really important that we have a good showing for this rally because it's early in the session. We expect some of the first hearings on Medicaid expansion to start that third week of January, which is the following week after this rally. And so it's really an opportunity to show the legislature and also show other Montanans that this is something that is really, really important and that we are going to be like watching and making sure that it happens. So encourage folks to save this time on your calendar, put a little thing in. We have been sending out flyers in various capacities for the rally, and we'll do so with the follow-up materials for this training as well. But would love for folks to, identify a few folks who could pack their cars and bring people to the session, to the Capitol for this rally on January 15th. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and move into our questions period. I know folks